The Solar Podcast Live is brought to you by Continental Energy Solutions. I'm Tim Montague, your host. Today, the energy switch, how companies and customers are transforming the electrical grid and the future of power. My guest today is Peter Kelly-Detwiler, co-founder of Northbridge Energy Partners, author and journalist. Welcome to the show, Peter.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Really excited to talk about your new book, The Energy Switch, which you see on your right shoulder there. And it's very heady days. The grid is 100 plus years old and it's showing its age. And there's lots of innovation happening in the power industry. And it's a very exciting, very heady days. And humanity clearly has an opportunity to tackle climate change, solve that problem and put it to bed. It's just a question of will we step up to the plate and do it, right? So give our listeners and our guests some background on yourself, Peter. How did you get so interested in energy?
Yeah, so I've been focused on sustainability since the late 80s. And I remember having an argument with my father-in-law that climate change would be the defining issue of my generation, which he thought was stupid, but I didn't. And I actually used to work in Africa in economic development, but came back to the States after a medical situation, and a friend was in clean energy, and it sort of fit into my ethos. And I ultimately ended up working for the Cree Indians, opposing massive hydro projects, then a couple of years in Chile, then got into competitive power markets in 1997 when they started, joined up with Constellation, headed up their demand response group, which was the second largest in the world, and ultimately left in 2012 to try and figure this whole thing out. But energy is just so critical to who we are as a species and our progress that it just attracted me in a way that nothing else had. And it's just so fascinating because the electron touches us at so many different levels that I just naturally gravitated to it.
It's really intrinsic, even biologically, right? When we drink a glass of water, we're harvesting electrons. That is the main thing. Of course, it's moving stuff around our body too, the liquid aspects of it, but biologically we are electronic. And so the electron is fundamental to our nature, soup to nuts. So it's only fitting that we should be so concerned about electrons, moving them around and running our society with them. But when things go south, it's really a disaster. And the grid is something that, unless you work in the industry, in the energy industry, you generally don't pay it much mind, right? You flip a switch here and there, and when it works, it's wonderful, and we mostly ignore it. But when it breaks, it's a catastrophe. And all of commerce and all of society comes to a screeching halt, really. If there was a catastrophic failure of the grid, 90% of people on Earth could be dead in a short period of time. And so we are no longer the hunters and gatherers of years gone by. We are a modern species that needs these electrons. So let's talk about how the grid is today and how it is changing and how it's going to change. And if you would, tell us more about Northbridge Energy Partners. What is it that you're up to in the world these days?
Yeah, so our job and mine now, because the other principal has moved on to other domains. My job is essentially to hoover up all kinds of information every day, from hydrogen to blockchain, everything affecting the electron, and then figure out how that impacts my clients' investment strategies, whether they're actual physical investors in the space or whether they're startups or established companies, and figure out where they should put their resources so that they can, proverbially skate to where that puck is likely to be. And the evolution of that is now happening so much more quickly than it was, say, 10 years ago. I mean, 10 years ago, we had in the United States about 600 megawatts of solar installed. And according to SIA, by the end of Q1 in March, we were at 97.7 gigawatts, right? That's how fast this is all evolving. So my job is to help people figure out what milestones they should be looking at that are indicating we're moving more towards this scenario than that scenario, and position themselves accordingly. And then obviously communicate that to as broad a swath of people as I can.
Yeah, and as we accelerate into the renewable energy transition, we're going to be adding tens of gigawatts of solar and wind, perhaps as much as 70 gigawatts of solar and wind a year to, if we're going to reach a clean grid by 2035. Those are the numbers that we're talking about. And it's totally doable. It's just a question of how we make it happen, how we choose to afford it. I liken energy from the sun to financial resources because at the end of the day, everything that we get money from comes from sunlight and human power and ingenuity. And without the sun, nothing happens on Earth, period. So we have this wonderful machine. Okay. It is said to be the most complicated machine that humanity has ever invented. I don't doubt that. And it's getting much more complicated now with these additional technologies that are coming on so strong, like wind, like solar, like lithium ion batteries. How did we get to where we are? And and then we're going to spend the bulk of the conversation peering into the mist of the future and putting down some signposts for our audience and authorities to really grab onto the opportunity because it is a huge economic opportunity to transform the grid. But how did we get to where we are today, I guess?
Well, so, if you peer back in the midst of time, you've got Edison and Westinghouse and Tesla all battling it out. And ultimately, with the advent of transformers, before you had separate grids for separate applications. Streetcar had a different grid than lighting did, than factories did, different voltages, right? And so transformers enabled an integrated utility to serve multiple end uses. And then you got the public utilities holding companies that came out of that, and these sort of massive utilities. Things stayed pretty much the same with these vertically integrated companies for decades and decades until the mid 70s, when Pinochet bombed Allende's La Moneda, the palace in Chile, and broke up the power structure. And part of that was state-owned utilities, and made the generators compete against each other. Maggie Thatcher in the UK looked at that and said, that's an efficient model. We want some of that. By the way, that was the neocons, Milton Friedman's group out of University of Chicago, and the Chicago Boys, which were the Chilean trained economists that follow that. Thatcher said, we want some of that, set up competitive markets in the UK. Large industrials in the United States said, oh, if generators competed against each other, we could get lower power prices here. Elcon and other groups like that. So by the mid 90s in California, Texas, PJM, mid-continental area, New York, New England, there was this push to have the utilities sell off generators, create these merchant companies that would compete. And around mid 90s, you start to see the emergence of these competitive power markets across about half the country. The rest of it, Southeast, Pacific Northwest, Southwest, remains vertically integrated, where utilities own wires and poles and gen. But these competitive markets really start to shake things up because the generators compete. In a subset of those markets, people can buy and sell power. And once you start to see these differentiated hourly prices for spinning reserve ancillary services, now entrepreneurs and vendors find a way in to create new solutions, to put solar on rooftops, to start to think about batteries. And this opens up this whole new set of opportunities across the space. So big picture, that's how it all starts to unlock and create these new steps.
And you're referring to deregulation, right?
Yes, although I call it restructuring because it's more regulated now. There's actually two sets of regulations, one for wholesale markets, which are super complex, and then the original Public Utilities Commission regulations for the wires and poles piece that still remains. So, but yes, restructure, deregulation, pretty much the same thing.
Yeah. And there are still ways, though, that companies like Exelon, for example, here in Illinois, we're a deregulated state, and we have Commonwealth Edison in northern Illinois. We have um, Ameren in central and southern Illinois, Mid American in western Illinois, and then we have all these uh, energy companies that are supplying kWh to the grid. But Exelon is vertically integrated within its suite of companies, including Constellation, right? Uh, so it's kind of a both and.
Yes,
But
although like ComEd has to buy power to supply its customers, and it may buy from another party, like Baltimore Gas and Electric, where Constellation started. BG&E acquires its electrons on the wholesale market. Could be they get them from Constellation, but there is some disconnect
yes,
there.
yep, yep. And meanwhile, I mean, let's face it, we consumers just don't, see almost any of this. It just, it's just happening in the background. We get our electric bill. It's pretty, it's a pretty regular number, generally speaking. There are exceptions. And, and maybe we could highlight some of those exceptions and what happened with the Texas grid outage and how some consumers and businesses and ultimately corporations really took it on the chin. And that fallout, of course, is still continuing. But set the stage a little bit for us. How is it that consumers can get really hurt when there's a spike in power prices?
Yeah, perfect question. So, in fact, in my bag next to me, I've got the floppy disk that I was given when I left Constellation, because in 1997, I rendered the first invoice in the competitive retail markets to a company called Providence Metallizing. So that's why I didn't have gray hair when I did that. Now, what happens in retail competitive markets is a customer says, I want to buy power for X amount of time. Let's say it's 3 years. And the retail suppliers, they buy power on the wholesale market, and then they turn around and sell it to that end user. Well, they're not flat blocks. People consume power differently every single day, and they typically tend to consume a lot more, and the grid does, on really hot days, and in some cases on cold days, like we saw in Texas, where the demand would have really spiked because of the need to heat homes in the cold weather. So most customers like to buy a fixed price. Say, for the next 3 years, I want to pay 10.17 cents per kilowatt hour because that's the best price I got from the 4 companies that offered me a price. What happened in Texas, in fact, I cover this in the book, because one of the people that I profiled was a guy who was a power trader himself. He bought power from a company called Griddy. And for just under $10 a month, you could essentially buy your power wholesale on the spot market. So he, for example, when prices would go negative, sometimes when there's a lot of wind in the system, or go down to a penny a kilowatt hour, he'd do his laundry. He would pre-cool his house in the morning, insulated home. And then when prices went higher during the day, he didn't use a lot of power because he'd already pre-cooled the home. So smart customers who knew what they were doing would see prices go high. Texas prices can go up to $9 a kilowatt hour, $9,000 a megawatt hour. That's the only market in which that can happen, because Texas isn't regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which puts caps at $1 a kilowatt hour or $1,000 a megawatt hour, but have capacity markets where they pay generators for steel in the ground. Texas says, no, we'll let prices go really high. And if they go high, that will incentivize new generation to come into the system. So what happened in this particular instance, a whole lot of companies said, oh, if we look at the spot market historically over the last, since 2011, spot market prices were way cheaper than locking in a fixed price and paying some kind of an insurance premium. And so Griddy had, tens of thousands of customers that had been saving money, but nobody expected this price to peg out at $9,000 a megawatt hour for day after day after day. And what happened was, these people essentially, they were buying weather derivatives, but they didn't know it. And if you think about that volatility, if I wanted to give you the Texas power buying experience with gasoline, and I knew you were headed to the pumps, I'd get there ahead of you, and I would cover over everything with duct tape. So you couldn't see the price per gallon. You couldn't see how much you pumped. You would see nothing. Then you'd fill up your truck with gasoline. And then later on, I'd say, aha, guess what? Instead of $3 a gallon, you paid $900 a gallon. Congratulations. And typically in our markets, we don't see the bill for 3 weeks, 4 weeks after we start consuming. So, these people in Griddy's situation, they actually had money pulled out of their account every day. It's part of their contract. People started to see $500 a day, $1,000 a day being pulled out of their accounts to pay for this real-time $9 a kilowatt hour, and it crushed them.
And then the other phenomenon there is that ERCOT, which is the Texas RTO, or Regional Transmission Organization, is kind of walled off from the rest of the grid. And so there isn't necessarily a free market phenomenon between ISOs. Is that true of other ISOs?
No, all the other ISOs have some level of interconnection. Between New York and New England, for example, when I was at Constellation, we'd have nighttime traders just trading the deltas between New York and New England, or New York and Pennsylvania, Jersey, Maryland, the Mid-Atlantic power pole. They're not huge interconnections, but they're certainly in the thousands of megawatts. Texas, by contrast, only has about 800 megawatts of DC transmission connections, a lot of that with Mexico. They purposely don't have synchronous AC connections because if you have interstate commerce, that allows the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to regulate what you do. And in fact, former Governor Perry and former DOE secretary famously said, we'd rather freeze for another 3 days than have the feds tell us what to do. The irony of that, though, is we were about 4 minutes away from total collapse of the Texas grid, which is the 9th largest economy in the world. And there's some thinking that if it had gone down, we would have broken a lot of equipment. So it wouldn't have been easy to start it. Even though Texas goes through this black start exercise, black start means taking a dead grid and jump starting it again, right? Applying the paddles in the ER to that defunct patient. So you have diesel generators that start up power plants that then connect across cranking paths to other power plants and bring up the grid. Well, a large number of those black start facilities, when they looked at them after the event, they were not capable. So potentially we could have had damaged equipment, no black start capability. And as Bill Magnus said, the CEO, we could have been out for 3 weeks, 4 weeks. So imagine the Houston Ship Channel not functioning anymore, gas compression lines pushing gas out to nowhere because they didn't work. So the rest of the United States not getting natural gas, the refineries in Texas all out for a month. We would have had a global economic calamity on our hands, not to mention no cell phones, no communication, nothing happening in Texas for 3 weeks. The loss of life could have been staggering in that situation. So whether or not they want the feds to have oversight in this situation, the power grid is disconnected, but the gas grid is connected, the economies are connected. So it's kind of a fallacy that Texas should potentially be able to operate that independently on its own because it has national security implications.
Absolutely. So the other thing that's going on, as we mentioned in the intro, is the grid is getting more complicated. We're bringing on lots of wind, solar, and now batteries. I noticed that there are 7 gigawatts of battery storage projects in ERCOT, in the ERCOT queue. That's more batteries than solar or wind in the ERCOT queue. So batteries are coming on very large scale now in our more mature markets like California and Texas and Hawaii. And in your home state there of Massachusetts, you have a great incentive for battery storage when it's paired with solar. But most solar owners, prosumers, don't even realize that their solar is useless if they don't have a battery in their garage and the hardware to microgrid from the grid if the grid goes down, because their solar array is going to get disconnected and be of no use to them. And so, okay, the grid is getting more complicated. We have some new technologies at our fingertips. Microgrids are now really accessible for the cost of a new car. You could get a solar array and a battery and a microgrid, so you can have some resiliency from the grid. But what are your thoughts about the newer technologies and this technology adoption curve that we're still down here,
Yeah.
but we're about to go vertical, and it's about to get much more complicated for the grid operators. But it's a good thing for humanity, right? Because we're going to save a bunch of lives from air pollution, and we're going to stop global warming if we do it fast enough.
Yeah, so the grid becomes very soon infinitely more complex than it is today because of exactly what you just pointed to. And in fact, if you look at, for example, Hawaiian Electric just released this past week its 2020 sustainability report. And the number of customers on the islands that have solar on the rooftops, like Maui, for example, is 50.8% renewables right now. And a huge chunk of that is customer-sided renewables. Now there's so much solar in Hawaii that they can't take the bidirectional flows, haven't been able to for years. And so now they say, if you want to put solar on in most places, you have to add a battery because you can't export from the roof. And what we found after Hurricane Sandy, if you were Superstorm Sandy, people who had solar on the roof thought, oh, I'll be inoculated, to use today's word that we all use, from power outages, and found out, nope, the inverter wouldn't let them, because you don't want to basically export power back to the grid and maybe electrocute a lineman, right, who doesn't know what's happening. And so, but now in the interim, we see storage coming in. So a company like Sunrun, the largest solar installer in the country, their CEO, Lynn Yorick, said that in the Bay Area, where they had those outages, fire-related in the 2 outages last year, 60% of their customers in the Bay Area that get solar get a battery as well. And SunPower saying the same thing in both residential and commercial industrial. Their attach rates for batteries are really high. Generac, we all know them from the infomercials, with the backup gas-fired gen. They're now moving into solar and storage because really you're providing a service. And Tim, the fascinating thing is, first they start with the solar, then they move to storage. Then companies like Generac buy Enbala, the grid balancing software company. Pretty soon, these companies are starting to sell grid resources behind the meter. So Sunrun, for example, has a contract with ISO New England, has had it for several years now, to sell 20 megawatts of capacity, like steel in the ground, all from aggregated behind the meter customers. Sonova, they just signed an 85 megawatt contract in ISO New England, got that approved in the capacity auction this year, where all the generators are offering capacity in. Now these guys are selling battery capability behind the meter. SunPower is also selling. And Sunrun now has over 10 contracts worth in excess of $50 million selling to grid operators and utilities. In a few years, and in fact, Elon Musk said this on the earnings call just this week, they will not put solar on a roof anymore without a power wall. So now that's the new hybrid. On the customer side of the meter, on the grid side of the meter, same thing is happening. Many of the large solar companies now put in de facto solar plus storage, and it's usually, say, 100 megs of solar, 100 megs of storage, and then 4 hours of duration. Typically, it's 4 hours is the sweet spot for that. So you're starting to see storage just come into the grid all over the place right now, particularly because the cost of lithium-ion batteries are falling by roughly 20 to 25% a year. Every time you double the global cumulative output of batteries, you're cutting the cost by 20 to 25%. The same trend we saw with PV modules for the last, 10 years.
Yeah, we've seen PV come down 90% or so in the last 10 years. And that's a godsend. It makes solar accessible. Solar was very expensive. Now it's accessible. It's still relatively expensive. It's an investment. Some of my guests can attest to that. Hello, Colin Murphy. Glad to see you here. And so let's talk about the future of the grid. And I'm glad that you mentioned these companies like Sunrun that are doing virtual power plants. It really is a combination of generating facilities and information technology that we need to blend together. And, I think about artificial intelligence a lot, and I really like my narrow AI. I have an EV that is a narrow AI. It does some self-driving. It's a pretty smart car, but it's very narrow. I want a narrow AI that runs the grid and moderates the ups and downs of the solar and the wind. And if a power plant goes out, or if a whole region goes out, it just solves the problem, right? And flips the switches that it needs to flip so that the lights keep running. how far away are we from something like that, a unified grid of the future where it's just like this global operating system?
So the challenge is you're overlaying that on top of an existing infrastructure, right? So the first thing that has to happen is if you, for example, looked at Chatterjee's former chairman of the FERC, Chatterjee's comment around FERC Order 2222, which was the federal order that basically said to all of the ISOs and RTOs, thou shalt create, quote, an operating model, unquote, so that distributed assets, whether they're batteries, water heaters, EV chargers, whatever, that they can sell services into the grid and be compensated like any other asset. And what that presupposes is, first of all, you have to understand state of readiness of all those assets. Where are they in the site? Is the battery fully charged? Is it empty? What's going on with the EV charger? When can I mess with the water heater or not? Or the other assets? And there are some estimates that a utility the size of Pacific Gas and Electric could have 20 million distributed assets within the next, say, 5 years, right? And in Chatterjee's announcement, he talked about 380 gigawatts being available to the grid, which is a huge chunk. Now, the challenge is this, Tim. You basically have this may well become the largest data play in the history of the planet, right? I mean, granted, autonomous vehicles has to have tons of data flexing back and forth as well. But in a grid with all these variable energy resources, the wind and the solar on one side, and then other variable resources on rooftops and water heaters interacting and batteries in the garage interacting and solar on the rooftop pouring energy into the grid, you have to have an extremely high level of situational awareness down at the feeder level. So let's say, for example, California ISO needs 50 megawatts to avoid that power outage they had last year. So they call a bunch of distributed companies with batteries behind the meter and hot water heaters and say, EV chargers, I need 50 megawatts for the next 3 hours, 2 hours, whatever. If they don't tell the distribution company that these aggregated assets are sending power the other way instantaneously upon request, the distribution company doesn't know, and their system might not even be physically capable of having that happen. So the first thing we really have to think about in this brave new world is we have to step back and say, okay, how many transactions might we be looking at? And for one client, they asked me specifically that question, and I basically looked at the growth rates of batteries, EVs, everything else, and then assumed X number of transactions per week, per month, per day. And it wasn't long until I got into the billions of transactions, in addition to the always on monitoring that you have to know. So ultimately, you can't do this sort of point-to-point communication. You have to create some kind of open architecture, permissioned, highly secure, so that hackers can't get into it. So the ISOs, RTOs see what they need to see. Distribution companies at the feeder level are mapping and seeing what they need to see at that GIS, at the geographic information level. Then the vendors aggregating their pieces see what they need to say and see, and there have to be hierarchies so that if a battery is supposed to be providing grid reliability, it can't have just discharged because prices were high. And so now when the grid operator calls on it to provide reliability services to keep the grid from going down, oh, sorry, I just sold my power out of that thing because prices were 4x what they were yesterday morning. So there's a whole ton of intelligence and architecture that needs to be developed. And ultimately, there might have to be some kind of a centralized, like the grid, I mean, like the internet itself, some information platform that everybody agrees upon and attaches to make sense out of what otherwise could be this indescribable Tower of Babel within the next 5 years.
Yeah, I think the internet is a good analogy. That's an example of a decentralized system that really works. Of course, it's a double edge, and it's not that we can't just let it run without moderating it or regulating it. And we're wrestling with that with like social media right now, obviously,
Mm-hmm.
because it can spin out of control and come back to bite us. But it can be used for lots of good things, for commerce and democracy, the spread of information and education. I'm a huge fan of what Musk is doing with Starlink, for example, bringing satellite Wi-Fi, satellite internet to rural communities. that is a huge, huge plus, basically, right, for people that live where there aren't good wire infrastructure. So, has somebody written the playbook, though, on a grid that is, as you say, decentralized but highly secure and self-correcting? I want humans to be, in the control room and watching the computers, right? But the computers can make decisions way faster and way more voluminously than we can. And so we want really good computers and then well-trained humans to keep an eye on the computers to make sure it all keeps running smoothly and doesn't get hacked and shut down. Of course, that's the other, I guess, shadow here is that the grid can be weaponized. And, uh, you know, Russia has demonstrated this, the United States has demonstrated this, and it is not infallible. And it is horrifying to think that a foreign power could cripple our grid and cause a major economic and life threatening failure.
Right. So let's take it a piece at a time. So in terms of the architecture, some of the national labs are doing great work, like PNNL, Pacific Northwest National Labs. There's a fellow there named Jeffrey Taft, who's been looking at this issue for a long time and has some models for an open type of an architecture. Now, the challenge around the cyber is really interesting because vendors and entrepreneurs, typically the last thing they focus on if they're bringing a new solution to the market is cybersecurity because it's a cost, right? And so, and every time you connect a new asset to the grid, you open up a new, what's called an attack path or an attack vector. One client that I had 2 years ago, I spent a good chunk of my time identifying all the information flows across the grid and trying to figure out how I could destroy the grid by spoofing data, by taking data and then pushing the wrong data, for example, to a control room operator to get them to do the wrong thing and take the grid down through corrective actions for something that hadn't happened. And that's sort of what happened in the Ukrainian attacks, both of those attacks, with the second one being much smaller but much more serious. Now we're in the situation where really the new battlefield, the new global battlefield probably is arguably cybersecurity. And the SolarWinds attack, NERC announced a couple of weeks ago that 25% of the utilities that report to it, I think the number was 345, reported having downloaded that tainted software. And there's a really good chance, because it wasn't discovered for 9 months, that the assailants have now burrowed their ways into our industrial control systems, gotten past the verifications and so on, just like they did in the Ukraine, and are now sitting in advanced persistent threat mode, resident in those industrial control systems, waiting for an opportunity to do something should that ever happen. Now, we've also done the same thing to other nation states. So in some sense, just like with the nuclear age with mutual assured destruction, our weapons were poised to be launched if they launched theirs. Perhaps more scary is the non-state actors, that there is nobody to attack, an ISIS or some shadowy amorphous type thing that doesn't really have a lot to lose and has a destructive ideology. So that is a very, very worrisome scenario in terms of a grid that's increasingly vulnerable to cybersecurity. And it's not just the industrial control systems, the SCADA. If you now have a future where the distributed assets are interacting with the grid every day, what's an EV charger meant to do, or a battery meant to do? It is meant to release a lot of energy at one time, or a battery to absorb. So if hackers wanted to, for example, could get into an EV charging infrastructure and rapidly cycle those things at the grid edge, potentially when those populations get big enough, that could destabilize the bulk power grid as well. So there are a lot of efforts being undertaken, SunSpec and California Rule 21, a whole lot of other things trying to figure out how do we make that more secure, with the inverter sort of the heart of that, because that's what communicates between the distributed assets and the power grid. But the assailants are almost always, it's like football. It's easier to score than play defense, right? And so the assailants are usually dreaming up the next thing, and the defenders are usually fighting the last battle. It's a really tough dynamic to overcome.
I like that analogy. Yeah, the next attack is being planned, and it's hard to know exactly what they're thinking or what their strategy is going to be. And they will be very creative and smart. There's lots of smart people that want to hurt other people. And so there won't be a shortage of talent. And I'm glad that the Biden administration is paying more attention, seemingly, to these problems. Uh, in my opinion, we need to really, uh, really up our game, both on cyber and energy and the energy transition. Um, there's just so many vulnerabilities. So you mentioned um, you mentioned cyber. What are some of the other big blocks, though? Okay, of this future grid. And thank you for mentioning the national laboratories. They are truly gems, right? And we're referring to NREL, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, Sandia Laboratories in Albuquerque, New Mexico, the Idaho National Laboratories in Idaho, and several in California. So we want, that is the example that I like to give of good government. Those laboratories are doing things that private companies are not going to do on their own. There's just not enough profit motive in that basic R&D that these laboratories are doing. We need good government to fund that effort and take our collective shoulder to the wheel, so to speak. What other big uh, chunks of the future grid do you think about as needing to come together for a more reliable and safe grid?
So yeah, I couldn't agree with you more on the national labs, although the study came out from the, what is that, the Council on Economic Competitiveness, that we're now number 10 in R&D, I think on a per capita basis. We have lost our leadership in pure science and need to get that back. Because that's where the future happens. Now, as far as how the grid unfolds, okay, so it's pretty clear that the grid edge is going to have an increasingly larger role, and we might end up developing some fractal designs so that just like a fern leaf, information flows back at higher and higher. It's collected at the edge and then consolidated and brought back, and intelligence made at different levels along that thing. More and more decentralized decisions will be made on the grid. The real challenge, though, is this decarbonization one. You see IRENA, International Renewable Energy Agency, say if we want to decarbonize society by 2050 fully, to keep ourselves at 1.5 degrees centigrade, talking about potentially $130 trillion of investment in clean tech, right? So we already know we're going to have a lot of solar and wind. We're going to have to up the game and put multiples in relative to what we're doing today. And we know today we can get a grid that is roughly, say, 40 or 50% carbon free just with wind and solar and batteries. The HECO, Hawaiian Electric Company report just shows, Maui's at 50.8% right now of renewables, and it's that wind and solar and batteries. Kauai is getting at 70%. They have a bit of pumped hydro and a little biomass, and they're shooting at 80%, right? So we know we can do a lot of that with solar plus storage, especially if you have maybe nighttime wind complemented by daytime solar, and then you peanut butter over the whole thing with 4 hours of storage, shifting energy to when it's needed. So then the next question is, okay, what do we need after that 4-hour sweet spot? And you start to see some 8-hour, 12-hour technologies out there for longer periods when you have overcast or the wind isn't blowing quite so much. But if you want to get to, say, 100% carbon-free grid, there's a really great study out of, I think it was Berkeley, showing a 90% grid. And the real challenge is a carbon-free grid. The real challenge is how do you get rid of the gas? Because there's a gas-fired generation sort of bubble from June to early October to deal with AC load. So then the question is, okay, if I get to 100%, I'm probably looking at the need, well, I am looking at the need for some long duration interseasonal storage. Pumped hydro doesn't get you that because it doesn't get you, except for Hydro-Quebec, where they have interannual storage, terawatt hours, of hydro capacity and energy. Most markets don't have that. So then the thinking is, All right, well, then it's probably hydrogen, green hydrogen. So you take wind or solar, you have your electrolyzer, convert water, separate the hydrogen and the oxygen out. Now you've got to liquefy or compress the hydrogen and store it. And then you have to either combust it in a turbine or use it in a fuel cell. And you lose 2/3 of the energy in that process. But nonetheless, if the electrolyzer costs come down, which they probably will follow the curve of batteries and PV and so on, and renewables are less than, say, $10 or $15 a megawatt hour. And in some places in the world, we saw that Saudi price, 10.04 cents, $10 per megawatt, 1.04 cents per kilowatt hour, right? So possibly we get to a situation where hydrogen does become that long duration storage. The Hydrogen Council announced about 2 months ago in a report, there are 228 projects around the world in some identified stage worth $300 billion. And of those, $80 billion worth, there have been a financial commitment already undertaken or they're in advanced planning. And we're talking, Tim, huge, like Shell is discussing this Aquaventus project in the North Sea, where they said it's going to be easier for us to build 10 gigawatts of wind offshore. And then instead of HVDC, high voltage DC cables to the mainland, we're going to put electrolyzers out where the wind turbines are and build one hydrogen pipeline to Europe. And part of the challenge is you don't want to just decarbonize the grid, you want to decarbonize society. And so what we're already seeing is the electron is starting to creep out of its normal applications in the grid into transportation, like we see in electric vehicles, into heating with beneficial electrification, heat pumps, air source heat pumps, ground source heat pumps, et cetera. Now we're starting to see the idea that the electron, through the medium of hydrogen, gets applied to the industrial sector. So Swedish steel manufacturer SSAB, responsible for 10% of Sweden's GHG emissions and 7% of Finland's. Steel is the largest industrial contributor. It's 8% of global CO2 emissions. They are desperate for a carbon-free solution. So they now, SSAB has a plant up in Luleå, north of the Arctic Circle in Sweden, called Hybrid, where they're using hydrogen to make sponge iron, which then can go straight into an electric arc furnace. So now you can make carbon-free steel. And guess what? Volvo announced 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, we're going to buy that steel and make carbon-free chassis so that our vehicle actually will be as carbon-free as we can make in the supply chain. So hydrogen has, just the same way batteries got their foothold in the electric vehicle space, and then the economies of scale drove the cost down so that it made it cost effective to apply it to the grid. The same thing is likely to happen here, where the first massive applications are hydrogen in the industrial space, and then the cost of the electrolyzers and the ecosystem builds out, and then it becomes applicable for long-term storage in the power grid, say 10 or 15 years out. But we don't have to solve that problem for today.
Yeah, the future of hydrogen is all of a sudden the present. You know, it's happening around us. Here in my community of Champaign-Urbana, we're getting a green hydrogen facility to power fuel cell buses. So these are electric buses that use hydrogen as a fuel to make electricity to drive electric vehicles. And they're building a solar array to produce the hydrogen with an electrolyzer, right? So you take solar energy, water, and you get electrons out. And you get hydrogen out, and hydrogen and oxygen. That is green hydrogen. Then there's also a vast gray hydrogen industry that the fossil fuel industries have been running. And, you know, a colleague at Shell recently told me, Peter, that green hydrogen costs about 3 to 6 times what gray hydrogen costs. The carbon footprint of gray hydrogen is horrible, though. And so my attitude is we just need to bite the bullet. We're swimming in energy. We just need to decide to harvest the solar energy and the wind power, because there is gobs and gobs more than we need, and decarbonize the grid. And like you said, we don't need to do it immediately, but we need to do it in the next 10 years. And it can be used then for industrial processes, like you mentioned, the green steel. That's a real thing. Now we can have green machines and green thermal industrial processes, and really the light is at the end of the tunnel now. I see a day 50 years from now when this is just a blip on the screen, this crisis that we're going through, but we totally have the technology to see our way through. We just have to be assertive and attack it. So long duration storage, 4-hour storage with lithium ion. What are the other technologies that you see in the mix here in the next 5 to 10 years?
So one that's underlooked or overlooked, I should say, first of all, our friend, the gas turbine, right? That was considered to be the bridge fuel. And you see fewer and fewer utilities making investments because some of them already know within 10 years, the crosshairs is going to be really, really strong on taking gas out of the system. I mean, we already see that, right? But in the meantime, those turbines still have to cycle a lot. Like in a place like California with the duck curve, you have your gas fleet, which is essentially cushioning the intermittency or the variability of the solar renewables and then the wind. And what they've done with the gas turbines on their way out, but still necessary for the grid right now until some of these other longer duration technologies come to play, is they've figured out how to make them a lot more flexible by digitizing them so that you can run them harder and you can ramp them faster, because instead of guessing based on run hours, you actually, with enough sensors and artificial intelligence, you can figure out, it's like having an MRI, a walking MRI on your gas-fired plants. And the real critical thing is when you need to cycle that thing down, putting it into turn down mode where it sits there in low idle mode. They get down to like, say, 30%. Below that, you have to turn them off. And so the real challenge for GE and others, and in the book, I actually got a chance to talk to the turbine team in Schenectady for about 7 hours. They told me what they're working on today are two things with the turbines. One, working on nozzle configurations, et cetera, so they can fire hydrogen through them in blends or pure hydrogen. It has a different flame speed. Hydrogen burns at a higher temp. The flame moves faster. So there's things you have to do to figure out how to configure the turbine. They've solved a lot of those problems. The other thing they have to do is figure out how to take today's turbines and make them even more flexible, and especially get them to lower and turn down mode, so that they still meet their NOx and SOx, the Dr. Seuss gases configurations, the nitrous oxide, sulfur dioxide. Because if you drop it below minimum turn down mode, now you have to turn the machine off and then bring it back from a cold start and expand all that steel to temperatures that can be hot enough almost to melt steel. They ceramic coat the blades, and the gases that move through that and combust do it at a high speed and high temps. And then the speed coming out the other side is faster than a hurricane, right? They're very, very complex machines at a certain level. So so getting the turbines to work better and then eventually converting them over to hydrogen is one of the pieces that also has to work out. And then the other sort of really cool tech space is beyond 4 hours, but not long duration. This, say, 4 to 12, 20 hours of storage, where you're seeing all kinds of companies, Energy Vault, with a prototype in Ticino, Switzerland, with a massive tower and 6 cranes dropping 35-ton or raising 35-ton blocks that have been specially engineered by CEMEX to absorb and release energy. That thing is now getting its permitting. In Pahrump, Nevada right now, there's a 20-acre gravel pit with inclines, and they're going to build trains with 320-ton cars on chains that go up and down the incline, absorbing or releasing energy based upon which direction they're going. The whole thing is going to be a 50-megawatt facility selling frequency regulation. And ultimately, if you want to absorb energy from the grid, leave the cars at the top. If you want to release energy, drop them back down. There's Molten Silicon, a company called 1414, which is the degree centigrade at which you melt silicon, where they're storing electric energy in the form of heat, which then can be spun a generator and also heat for industrial applications. Other companies with different molten configurations of X, Y, or Z. Siemens is using hot rock, wind energy, heating up volcanic rock and then using that to spin turbines, or direct heat applications to industry. So there are all these really fascinating companies. Another one, Gravitricity. They're looking at abandoned mine shafts, and then they have motors and they raise or lower these massive ton weights up or down in mine shafts. There's one mine shaft they're looking at in South Africa that's 1.2 miles deep. And they just tested on the 21st of April in Spaith, this port in Scotland, their first 250 kW machine, raising and lowering that thing and measuring how much energy it was releasing to or absorbing from the grid. So there's all kinds of entrepreneurs along the edge trying to figure out these new technologies and which ones can scale at what costs and where they're competitive and where they're not. It's a fascinating time to look at the players in the space right now.
Yeah, if there's any question of running a society on thermal power, just go to Iceland, and you'll see it before your eyes, right? So, taking sunlight and concentrating it and making molten the inverse of what the Earth does at its core is totally a thing and totally doable. And the same with gravity batteries. It's great to see all these battery uh, technologies coming on. The gravity technologies. I want to encourage our listeners to ask questions. We just have a few minutes left with Peter Kelly-Detwiler, the author of The Energy Switch. And I know that we have some very smart people on here on the live, so please put your question in the chat or in the Q&A. Either one is fine, and we'll get your question answered live. Peter, I guess the other thing that's always in the wings for me is getting more people interested in the energy industry. I myself was a late comer, and even though I was engaged in my backyard by my father, who's a technologist and a DIYer, and that's why solar was a homecoming for me, because I was doing renewable energy in my backyard as a kid in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I'm concerned that more people aren't getting into the industry to help us make this transition. And I'm not talking about academics. I'm talking about the boots on the ground, people that, that know how to hook up the pipes and wires and the turbines and the gravity batteries that we're going to need. Do you have any thoughts on the future of education?
Yeah, I did a Forbes piece a couple of years ago, one of the over 300 that I've written in my sort of desperate attempt to figure out how this whole ecosystem was evolving. And it was a community college in, I think it was in South Carolina. And unlike, where you're paying $60,000 to go to Harvard, Princeton, Williams, someplace like that, this is like $10,000 a year for tuition. Arguably still something, but these students, they actually had a transformer on campus. So they were hands-on learning. They were graduating after 2 years in this program and making anywhere between 60 and 80K a year, depending where they were, right? So community colleges have a huge role to play. I also think we need to bring back the whole apprentice type of a program and strengthen that in ways we haven't. Europe's got a huge apprentice program, which has been very successful over decades. I was an exchange student in Germany in '78 and saw that firsthand with friends of mine who were working in that. So I think there's a lot we can do there. One thing that I've done is I have this thing on called Pick My Brain, where every first Friday of the month for students, I have a subject matter expert in the space. So this Friday, May 7th, is Peter Wygand, who's the CEO of Skipping Stone, and he's going to be talking about how you get into the industry. Last month, I had a person who was talking about how power markets work, and the month before that was the Texas debacle. And so students can just sign up for free. They just send me an email at my email address and put Pick My Brain in the heading, and then I just put them on the mailing list. And the idea is to expose students coming out of school or still in their last year to multiple professions in the industry so they can get a better sense of what it's like on the ground and what they might be interested in.
And how do people find those Q&A sessions?
So I've recorded the first one, but haven't posted it yet. Up until now, they've just been live. And so basically
on LinkedIn or on what platform?
Yeah, it's on LinkedIn. If you just shoot me something on LinkedIn saying I want to join Pick My Brain, then I'll put you on the mailing list.
Gotcha. Great. Well, we have a couple questions from Thomas. What is the or what does the EROEI of hydrogen portend for the future of this technology? And I'm going to spell that acronym out just for our listeners: energy return on energy invested. So what is the EROEI of hydrogen?
Yeah, it's about 30%, right? Because you lose all the way through the process from the electrolyzer to the energy required to either compress or liquefy. And then some is lost in the transportation, the storage, but then the other conversion efficiency that's not so great is in the combustion of the fuel cell at the end. That's why the inputs have to be really cheap, the renewable energy in the electrolyzer process. And the electrolyzers themselves has to come down significantly in cost from where they are today in order to make this cost effective. That said, Bloomberg said within 5 years, green hydrogen should be cheaper than blue, which is gray, and then with carbon capture and underground storage. So they suggest don't even waste time focusing on blue. Go and throw all of your resources at green to drive those costs down as fast as we can.
Makes sense. Another question from Thomas is about superconductivity. What is the role? And this is, I think, especially relevant to HVDC perhaps, but uh, do you see much about superconductivity?
I mean, you see it like, for example, the American superconductor has their DSMAS, which actually helps to smooth out what's happening in wind turbines. They've been very successful in that space for a long time. They had originally been pushing with Pirelli high efficiency lines. That hasn't really seemed to have gained a lot of traction, but now with all these massive offshore wind deployments and the Biden administration talking about 20 gigs of lines, maybe, I mean, it's going to be a question of your HVDC line now might lose 4%. What's the economics of, bringing in this new technology, and do the costs outweigh, the savings?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it takes energy to supercool these conductors.
Yep.
They do get much more efficient, but it's a lot of energy. And this is my question, Peter. What do you think about fusion? I know that there's some progress being made in Europe on, small scale fusion reactors. Is this a technology that you and I will see in our lifetimes?
I had hoped so. When Lockheed had announced that they were going to be able to put a 100 megawatt reactor that would fit on the back of a truck. And they indicated that because the fusion reactor they were working on, and it's the magnetic bottle, it's how you capture the thing and, hold it in place, was the real critical issue. And they said because it was small, they thought they could iterate. And they made a press release about it. And to get a press release out of Lockheed, you have to have something. And then crickets. This is like 6 years ago. I actually emailed them a couple times in an effort, unsuccessful, to find out if there was a there anymore. The challenge with that and with modular nukes as well is you're now trying to compete against wind and solar that can come in at $10, $15, $20 a megawatt hour, add another 4 hours of storage, which comes in another, say, $10 to $15 a megawatt hour. Those modulars are saying their target is $60, and they're going to be competing against renewables that obviously don't have 100% capacity factor, but you just rip out so many hours of the day with much lower prices that it gets harder for those technologies to gain a foothold as renewables get cheaper.
Yeah, that was Thomas's other question, is about next gen nuclear. And I think that for space-based applications, it makes a lot of sense to continue to develop those technologies. We need nuclear reactors that are safe and modular and smaller. So let's keep doing that R&D, but let the economics drive the equation here on Earth. If they can compete, fine, but if they cannot compete with wind, solar, and battery storage, then so be it. There's no reason that we have to have nuclear power. I'm not generically opposed in any way. If we can make it safe, I'm all for it, and make it 100% available. That is one of the beauties of nuclear. Is it's there. It's not that nuclear plants don't have downtime; they do have to refuel and things like that. but certainly they have a higher capacity factor than wind and solar. So, Peter, unfortunately, our hour is up and we have to say goodbye to you. It's been wonderful. I feel like I'm talking to my other brother from another mother here. This has really been wonderful. I really appreciate your time. How can our listeners and viewers get your new book, The Energy Switch?
Well, it's on pre-order at Amazon, but I would encourage you to go to your local bookstore, because we want to support the indies wherever we can. And my family actually owns one. So, in fact, on my website, I have the link to my local indie bookstore. But yeah, I think Amazon is certainly one opportunity. I hope you enjoy the book. I try to tell stories of different people and different companies engaged in the space to try and create the on-ramps through their experiences rather than just go tech right from the start. My goal was to try and make it more accessible to a broader readership. I hope I've succeeded in that. We'll see.
I just put your website, northbridgeep.com, on the screen. So check out that, Northbridge Energy Partners. I want to make a couple of announcements. We have all of these interviews hosted at our website at Continental Energy Solutions. The URL is cesenergy.com/podcast or /events. We do these monthly live events where you pre-register and then get to interact with thought leaders like Peter Kelly-Detwiler. But we're also bringing you tons of solar and storage content. Here we have Mark Klagina and Mr. Rodriguez talking about grid interactive buildings, and Rich Henry, intelligent project siting, and Omid Badkube, rooftop storage. So many wonderful interviews on tools and technology and thought leadership in the clean energy transition. Well, I want to thank you again, everybody who was on the live today, for joining us. Really appreciate your presence and your questions. And I want to thank you, Peter Kelly-Detwiler, for coming on the show.
It was my absolute pleasure. Thanks so much.
I'm Tim Montague, your host. Let's grow solar and storage. Have a great day, everybody.